Introduction and Installing Internet Information Services 6. IIS 6 is the latest version of Internet Information Services, Microsoft's web server platform. There's been quite a few changes to IIS in version 6, although a lot of them aren't directly visible to the administrator. A lot of these changes are under the hood. Now, Microsoft have made IIS 6 more reliable than ever before. The new architecture of IIS isolates websites from each other, so a misbehaving website won't affect other websites that you're hosting on the same server. IIS 6 is also easier to manage. Unlike earlier versions of IIS that use binary configuration files, IIS 6 uses XML, and you can even make configuration changes to IIS on the fly whilst your server is still running. So no more restarting IIS every time you make a change, and that'll certainly be a welcome feature to people hosting a lot of websites on their IIS server. Now, because IIS is faster and more efficient, you can run more websites on a single server, and that can mean requiring less servers overall. IIS can also be configured to run on specific CPUs when you have a multi-processor server. And finally, IIS is more secure. In fact, it's not even installed by default on a Windows 2003 server, and when it is installed, applications must be explicitly allowed to run, and this security is a welcome addition. Now, we won't go any further with any of these new features right now. We'll discuss these in detail during the course of our IIS 6 videos. So we'll get stuck into installing IIS on our Windows 2003 server. Now, seeing as Microsoft like us to use the new Manage Your Server wizards, we'll click on Start and we'll launch Manage Your Server. Now, the first thing we need to do is add a role, so we'll come over here and we'll choose Add or Remove Role. Now we'll just need to ensure that everything's plugged in and working, so we'll click on Next, and this will quickly query our server to find out what's currently installed. Okay, over here on the left we can see a bunch of roles that we can configure on our server, and on the right we can see if it's currently installed. Now, since this is a brand new installation of Windows 2003, we don't have any roles defined yet. So to install IIS 6 on our server, we'll simply select the Application Server role, and then we'll choose Next. Now we're asked if we want to allow front page server extensions and ASP.NET. Now, front page server extensions are used to enable users of client computers to publish content to our IIS server as well as administer our websites. Now, you would want to choose this option if you want to publish your content directly from front page or VisualStudio.net. Now, ASP.NET is the newest version of ASP, or Active Server Pages, which is Microsoft's answer to things like Perl, PHP and JavaScript. So for our purposes, what we'll do is we'll just enable them both and we'll choose Next. We now just get a summary of what we're about to install, and you'll notice that COM+ and the Distributed Transaction Coordinator have also been selected by default, even though we didn't get the opportunity to choose them. The COM+ option, in its simplest explanation, provides a means to reuse code without requiring it to be recompiled, and the Distributed Transaction Coordinator is the tool used to coordinate the COM+ transactions. Now, by the way, when we install IIS 6 using this method on a new server like we're doing here, we will by default be installing IIS 6 in Worker Process Isolation mode. This is the new, more robust mode of IIS 6. Now, conversely, if we were upgrading an earlier version of IIS, then the default installation mode would be IIS 5 Isolation mode. Now, it's certainly worthy of mention that if you do install IIS 6 in Worker Process Isolation mode, the default mode that we're going to install in now, then you thoroughly test your applications and your websites to ensure that they work as expected. Now, it's unlikely that you will run into any problems, but if your site starts behaving erratically, then you should switch back to IIS 5 mode as an option, or consider upgrading your web applications to run in IIS 6 mode. But we'll show you how to do all of that later, and we'll talk more about this subject later on in this series. Alright, we're ready to go, so we'll click on Next. Now make sure you have your Windows 2003 CD-ROM in the drive, and IIS will begin installing. Now I'll just pause this video and we'll return once IIS has been installed. Okay, the files have been copied and now IIS 6 is installed on our Windows 2003 server, so we'll click on Finish. And now we can see here that our server has an application role defined for IIS. Now installing IIS is a relatively painless operation as you've just seen, and now that we've installed IIS on our server, we can move on through the rest of this video series and take an in-depth look at the features and options we have with IIS 6.